Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session of the First Responders Wellbeing Summit. We're delighted to have you here and an incredible panel of speakers to discuss the important topic of valuing volunteers this afternoon and how we best look after the first responders volunteers that look after us. My name is Donna Newbury. I'm with Wellbeing Australia, and on behalf of the whole team, we are absolutely delighted to host this summit. A couple of things about Wellbeing Australia is firstly that we are very proactive focused. So we really support people making sure that they build their well-being proactively, that we really try and educate you, give you as many skills and tools and resources to educate yourself on well-being. And we focus very much on the solutions rather than the issues that result in poor well-being. We really try and focus on how you manage your well-being and the solutions. Secondly, we are a national not-for-profit that's based entirely on volunteers' work ourselves. So important that we're speaking about this today. But the other thing is that we are member funded, and so we don't receive any funding from government or any other agencies, and therefore don't have any hidden agenda in what we'll be discussing today. It really is purely about sharing stories. And I think a third important thing is that today we are really focusing on you, our first responders, our volunteers. So our audience is really broad today. We've got a number of volunteers online, so welcome to all of you. We have volunteer organizations. And in fact, where the entire organization is voluntary, but we also have organizations that do have volunteers as part of a critical part of their response. We also have first responders who are in partnership with volunteer organizations, families of volunteers and first responders, and also first responders themselves. So very broad, and by first responders, we mean anybody who's ever found themselves in needing to respond to some sort of crisis, whether you are a farmer with a hose protecting your house, or somebody who happens to be first on the scene, right through to trained and uniformed first responders. So we're going to be as broad with that definition as possible today. The summit's theme this year is living well. And we believe that there are three tenets to living well. The first is about connection, both with yourself as well as with the healthcare professionals that can help you should you need them, and counselors, peer support, etc. The second is around hope. And hope, we believe, is really such an important part of well-being, the belief that things are going to get better. And hope is not just built out of our physical and psychological health and well-being, but also, very importantly, through, as we've seen in the last year with COVID, our social well-being, as well as our spiritual well-being. And by spiritual, I don't mean denominational in any sense, but that sense of purpose, that sense of duty, that sense of some cause larger than ourselves. So we believe that all parts of those are critical to well-being, and we will be talking about some of those topics today with our wonderful panel. Before I introduce our panel, I wanted to just emphasize today that you'll see along the bottom of the Zoom that there's a Q&A section. If you would like to pose a question to any of the panelists today, please do. We really encourage you to participate, to ask questions. And if you could, please pose it in that Q&A section, that will be great. And it's completely confidential, so nobody else will see any question you ask. However, if you make comments in the chat function at the bottom, those will be visible to everybody. So just be mindful of that. If there is something that's more appropriately confidential, then please don't put it in the chat function, because it will be visible to everybody on the call tonight. So without further ado, I just wanted to welcome our three lovely panelists for this evening. The first is Louise Murphy. Louise is a registered nurse with over 30 years experience. She's a Churchill Fellow, and she's with the Australian First Responder Foundation. But that's not all. She's also a volunteer for the St. John Ambulance, and she currently works in bushfire relief recovery as a coordinator for the Shoalhaven Local Health District, Illawarra and Shoalhaven Local Health District. So welcome, Louise. Our second panelist this evening, Wade Norrie. Wade is Director of Nursing for New South Wales Health, as well as the Nursing Lead for St. John Ambulance New South Wales, and Chair of the Board of the Australian First Responder Foundation. Welcome, Wade, delighted to have you with us. And our third panelist this evening is Helen Madell. Helen is a clinical psychologist with extensive experience in supporting volunteers, particularly in bushfires, but also in other areas. So welcome to all of you. Louise, maybe if we can start off with you to just introduce yourself a little bit about your passion for volunteers and looking after volunteers in the first responder context.
Sure, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be able to join everyone this evening. So my background is nursing, mental health nursing, and I'm a very passionate St. John Ambulance volunteer and have been a volunteer for over 18 years. I'm very dedicated and committed to looking after the mental health and wellbeing of our emergency first responders, and with a specific focus on volunteers. And in fact, my Churchill Fellowship that I undertook in 2019 was around peer support and how do we look after our volunteer emergency first responders when we think about peer support and mental health and wellbeing. So yeah, thank you again for inviting me.
Wonderful. Welcome, Louise. We can't wait to hear the stories that you have to share. Wade, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Don. Evening, everybody. So yeah, my background is also nursing. I'm a mental health nurse of approximately 35 years. In my paid world, I'm currently a director of nursing with the Western Sydney Local Health District for mental health. But in my volunteer world, I'm also with St. John Ambulance, as you kindly introduced before. I'm the currently the nursing lead for St. John Ambulance New South Wales. I'm also a peer support officer with the St. John team as well. So I'm very, very passionate about the welfare, well-being of my peers, my colleagues in the volunteer world. I think that carries over from my professional world, but yeah, I'm really, really excited to be here tonight and hopefully be able to contribute.
Excellent, I'm sure you will. Lots of incredible wealth of experience and knowledge there, so thank you and welcome, Wade. Helen, over to you, welcome.
Yes, thanks, welcome, and appreciate all the warm welcome from everybody. And yeah, so I guess with myself, believe it or not, Louise and Wade, you're going to laugh at this. I actually am an ex-nurse.
This is the nurses' convention.
This is nurses' convention. So
there's no such thing as an ex-nurse.
That's true. That's true. So basically, I actually am also retired from the military. I started my career in the military, having been a first responder, had a significant exposure to mental health issues whilst in the military, and noticed the way in which things were managed. Thought to myself I'd leave the organisation and actually get some formal qualifications in the area because I was a medic in the army. So I left the army, and nursing, which was my qualification that the army had given to me as part of my service, helped me through to get my qualification as a psychologist. So have been a clinical psychologist now for quite a few years, and I lecture now also at the university here in where I live in Rockhampton. But whilst I was doing my clinical study, I actually became engaged with the first responders again, which was fantastic, because that was the whole premise as to why I left the military. I actually wanted to come back and help those in first responder organisations. So I did my research with first responder organisations, with Queensland Ambulance Service, and my research was into prevention programs for trauma. And I am also the Regional Supervision Counsellor for Central Queensland here. What that means is basically I oversee and help the peer support officers, and the peer support officers that exist in the Queensland Fire and Rescue Service are both volunteers as well as paid staff. So we get a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to the supervision and how they sort of, their motivations as to why they become not only a PSO, but why they're engaged in the service in the first place. So it is really quite interesting how we work with that. And then on top of that, I also, as part of my role there with the Regional Supervision Counselling, I actually go out to stations and sheds and other places and touch base with the volunteers as well as families.
Wow, thank you, Helen, and it's such an honour to have you here tonight with us and bringing such a wealth and diversity of experience, so thank you for that. All right, well, we have a lot of questions already coming in, and Louise, I think I'm going to throw the tough one up at you first. Is wellbeing for volunteers different, and if so, how?
Well, that's an interesting question. In terms of different, I suppose everyone's wellbeing is individualised, and I think that's an important note to make. I know that people often join emergency services or are first responders for very different reasons, and because of that, we come to services with varied resilience, varied backgrounds, experiences, strengths. So in terms of, well-being, what does that look like and what does that mean for a first responder? I would say that, and there's I used a quote that someone said to me whilst I was overseas, is that whether or not you're a volunteer or you're a paid first responder, we basically respond to the same or similar incidences, emergencies or disasters, although we're wearing different uniforms. So in terms of, we all have mental health, and I suppose the principles in terms of maintaining people's well-being are very much individualised. So, I think there's different services offer different well-being offerings, and it looks different for whatever service that individual may work for, but I think there's a lot of factors. It's not as easy as just saying that someone's well-being is either are the same, because again, as I pointed out, everyone's different.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Louise. I was going to say, like when you were talking about that when I think about people who volunteer, not only is it about their well-being, their whole purpose actually sits in with that. Like you volunteer because there's something intrinsically that you feel that actually drives you to do that volunteer in that specific role. So yeah, you're right with that well-being. It's very broad, but it also actually is one of the motivators, what gets us in to that volunteer role in the first place.
And Helen, maybe we can stay on that a little. I guess the concern is that many first responders are so passionate, so kind, so giving, so sometimes sensitive to the plights of others, and that's why they do want to help. Generally very caring individuals. Does that predispose them to need to take care of their well-being proactively even more?
A little bit, but if we even look at biologically what happens when we give, so altruism has this amazing effect on the brain. So it hits two big areas of the brain. One is called the limbic system and one is called the cortical regions of the brain. So the limbic system is all about emotional assessment and believe it or not, it's also about pain. So you know, you can imagine there with regulation and stuff with our emotional well-being, how it might also have an impact on other parts of our health. Maybe by having that focus, we might have less pain, difficulties or so forth, but it also has this big part of our reward part of our brain as well is hit when we actually go into altruistic sort of stuff as well. So this part of the brain helps with our slow waves of sleep. So altruism actually can be a protective factor when you think of it that way. I'm possibly helping my sleep. I'm possibly helping regulate some parts of pain. And then you think about other things. So the cortical regions of the brain that are affected when we're altruistic are things like our long-term memory. You know, it helps with the retrieval. So altruism actually is improving my mind, and it helps things like, I don't know about yourselves, but if I'm on holidays for a long time, I start to forget what day of the week it is. Lockdown also had that effect. I started to think, was it Sunday? And no, it was Monday. I better get dressed and go to work. You know, it had this mind-blowing effect on days and this spatial stuff. But when we actually are engaged in altruism, what it allows us to do is it once again has that part of the brain ticking over. So we're more spatially aware of that sort of stuff. So does it actually hinder us? Well, there's some things that we've got to keep the volunteers engaged in so they don't get burnout. But is it more protective than anything? If I could be a little bit cussy, hell yes. You know, it's really good for the brain.
Excellent. Wow, good to know that doing good for others is also good for you. But I guess, Wade, over to you, a question really about your long history with St John Ambulance in New South Wales. You know, I can imagine that volunteers in your organisation are exposed to a lot of trauma, not just of the individual affected, but sometimes family, friends, and the situation. How do you best prepare volunteers who are coming in and out of that situation, as opposed to people that are in full time with St John Ambulance to cope and deal with those situations?
It's a great question, and I think if we had the perfect answer, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I got the hard question first, guys.
We'll back you up, don't worry.
It's an interesting thing because so from a St John Ambulance perspective, you know, and having a nursing background and volunteering, a lot of the nurses, for example, and the medical officers, the paramedics, they come to a volunteering space with learned skills. So they come. We bring to that you know, the weekend event, whatever that is, a whole bunch of professional experience that we can apply in a volunteer setting as well. So you got to remember that. I mean, when we get out on a duty, you know, a volunteer duty, you know, community event, you know, there's myself as a registered nurse standing beside someone who's a first responder or advanced first responder who might be a teacher by day, or someone who's a student who's trying to, you know, develop their community portfolio, et cetera, et cetera. So they all bring with them a whole bunch of lived experience already and professional experience. So how do you develop those people? Well, training, you know, training and more training. You're providing as many opportunities for people to actually practice that skill in a safe place. Give them their education and understanding of what they might be actually going to experience beforehand. And from a psychologist perspective, so telling you, providing some sort of exposure to the process, obviously safely, before people get there. So yeah, we do our best to prepare people. So and one of my favorite sayings, and from a sort of a coaching, a sporting background that I have, is that it's deliberate practice. We have to engage in deliberate practice. So when we talk about the events and what we're going to meet, we step through it, we visualize it, etc. But we also need to step through and visualize post-event and what that might look like, and actually looking after each other, and those you know, immediately following the event, and you know, 24 to 72 hours later, what might actually happen, etc. So we prepare people for what they might feel like as well.
Yeah, and I reflect on what you just said there, Wade. Sorry, if it's like with that, it's about then when you give them that position description almost, and you take them through those scenarios, like you're saying, Wade. You're right, because what it also prepares them for is whether or not they feel capacity and what level that they can participate in this organisation. So I don't know. I mean, with St John's, there would be a varying type of tiered way you're actually engaging with people, wouldn't there be?
Absolutely. I mean, we all have different degrees of mastery. And I think that, you know, that's what we encourage. You know, that we come with resilience. You know, reality that we're upright breathing in here today demonstrates some resilience. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff we bring to it, but you know, there's a degree of mastery and practice that goes, you know, that comes with being in I suppose, an organisation, you know, a training and learning environment. So I think that there's something in common with volunteerism. So as we were saying before, that purpose and that giving back to the community and the altruism, etc., that helps drive that stuff. And I think there's a protective factor, as you're saying, Helen, in that component too. So preparing people is also inclusive of that altruism as well.
Can I just make a comment? I suppose from my perspective, it's very much about people volunteers being confident and competent. So we need to ensure that, one, they're competent with the skills, and that's when it comes back to, as Helen and Wade have said, around that training, the deliberate practice, the preparedness, and we get people to, you know, practice things when life is going well, so that, you know, we know that memory, that muscle, you know, has a memory, and that, you know, when they're under pressure, well, then we know that then able to be responsive. So, you know, we encourage people to become competent, but also confidence. And that sense of confidence comes with that sense of connectedness. You know, we're all in this together, you know, that peer support, you know, feeling confident that you're able to step up to the plate and to actually do the job, and that your mate has got your back and you've got your mate's back. So I think it's a combination of, you know, of those two things. And the other thing too, I mean, reality is, as a first responder, in a sense, we sign up knowing that, you know, we potentially could be exposed, and we are exposed to, you know, traumatic incidences. And that varies, you know, from individual services and all those sorts of things. But reality is that, and I always use the quote, so sorry for those that have heard me say it before, but you can't walk through water and expect not to get wet. Reality is we're human beings. You know, we also have, you know, feelings, emotions, you know, all those sorts of things. And that's okay. It's okay to actually say that, you know, this is impacting on me. But, you know, in terms of how do we, in a sense, try to minimize that risk or reduce the risk, is very much around, as Helen and Wade has said, about that practice, training, education, you know, skill development.
Good.
And even as you're saying, Louise, though, too, it's also about, like you said, competency, and it's got to be meaningful. We've got to, because we know one of the big things when it comes to burnout is if it's not meaningful, that's when they will drop out.
Absolutely.
So
and we know that volunteerism, you know, gives people that sense of purpose and that sense of meaning. And interesting, Donnie, I'm looking behind you, and if we were to, you know, think about why is it that people become volunteers and first responders, it is, you know, in line with the theme. It's about that connection, you know, that community, you know, coming together. We're all in it together, and being able to offer hope, you know, to help support the community and serve the community in whatever that may look like.
Agreed. Great points. Thank you. Thanks so much. Helen, I just wanted to pick up, I guess, a little on something you said. And, you know, we've spoken a little now about the importance of that practice and that real life, you know, preparation of sort of laying down those habits and pathways. So once they're in the situation, they know how to respond. I guess it's been a really interesting question come through from the audience about, What about when they go back to their everyday life? Is there a delayed response, and how do you best prepare and cope with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the difficulties with, unfortunately, when we are volunteering or we're only temporarily here or there in particular places, and I think of things like, if I'm called out to a critical incident, let's say, because I'm in Rockhampton, let's say if I went to Brisbane and I attended that and then went back home, one, no one in Brisbane knows me, so they won't see any sort of shifts in my set of who I am. So they're going to miss all these cues that I'm perhaps a little bit impacted by this stuff. And it's not until often then we're also out of that fight, flight, freeze situation that then we have that bit of time, the sequela of the mind settles down and it goes, whoa, that was something else, wasn't it? And so then it takes at least, we say 28 days for the brain to settle after something like that. So, you know, this is where it's not often seen at the shed, or it's not seen at the station, it's seen by the family. And one of the things I do here in central Queensland is I actually go out and do education, not just with the volunteers. I actually have the families come and we have a big barbecue and they have their kids there, and it's a bit of a get together, and it's really good also in another way too. It's saying we value you as a volunteer, but it's also good as in I give them a bit of psychoeducation. You know, when your partner comes home and they're still, you know, consuming copious amounts of alcohol or caffeine, you know, you can see behavioural shifts in them, the cynicism, or, you know, the lack of engagement with certain things. And then that might be cause to, you know, have a bit of action there and encourage them to sort of speak to someone or something like that. So yeah, it's very easily missed. That's the one point that we've got to try and capture with our volunteers. And, you know, I think those things are a really big thing to actually help people to get together. I don't know. I mean, do you guys do much in regards to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think about it as uniform on, uniform off, and it's that transition. So, you know, if you've been on an event or, you know, in a situation, a critical incident, and you've been exposed to it, we're more than likely as volunteers to go home to our loved ones and our family. And of course, you don't, you know, want to share the details with them. And so I think sometimes as volunteers, we can potentially get missed in that. I've got a full-time job, so I've been exposed to a critical incident, say, on a weekend. I'll go home, you know, try to transition back into my role as a, you know, a mother and a grandmother and a wife. And then the next morning, I may get up and then go to work and think, well, I've just got to get on with it, because I actually may not want to take time off work to be able to go and access support services. And then eventually, you know, over time, you know, then I start to perhaps wonder, why am I feeling like I've got no motivation, or I'm disconnected, or I just don't want to go back to do another event or another, you know, another duty in the case of St. John. So I think very much it is about that, how do you transition? And I really agree with Helen in that, and when we do our peer support training, we've, you know, in the St. John context, we invite family members or loved ones in to attend on the day, so that, or days, so that, you know, the family member actually have an understanding of what sort of things perhaps, you know, they should look out for, you know, in their loved one, because they're generally the ones, either the family or the peers are the ones that are going to actually take or notice some sort of change or difference. And they're the ones that are able to, you know, be able to provide the feedback and help, you know, the individual or first responder, perhaps, you know, reach out for some, you know, professional support if required.
Wade, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I think Louise sort of jumped in on a subject matter there that I was kind of interested in following a bit. That business about, when we do go home, paid employees have got fairly structured programs and supports in place, we can put our hand on a number of whatever else and refer to an EAP and psychologists and wrap people up fairly tightly from an employment perspective. A volunteer can go home on a Saturday or a Sunday after an event, or even say they deployed to the bushfires last season, and they spent 5 to 7 days away. They come back and they just disappear into the ether. You may not see them at a local meeting or for weeks or weeks. So from an organisational perspective, that's where we found that peer support programs are really, really important, and encouraging people to talk about stuff, because it's not just about that critical event. It's not just about that that cardiac arrest that wasn't successful, or that bike accident, or whatever the case may be, the trauma. It's not all about that. It's spending 5 days being awake at bushfire. And you've never done that before, and being away from your family and not understanding how that's going to impact on you. And then when you get home, you go, well, why can't I sleep, and why am I still smelling smoke? And and what is it about? What is it about the television now? They're talking about fire that I just can't watch it anymore, and stuff like that. So yeah, volunteers are, I suppose I'm being a bit biased here, but we're a bit special in that group, and that we do go home to family and friends, etc., and that's it. So from a self-care and well-being perspective, the investment beforehand is imperative.
Yeah, and I come back to, like, when I'm working with volunteers, I always get them to tap in. And even myself, I mean, I do a lot of things in the role that is a bit above and beyond what some people would do in this role, but it's about understanding what purpose, why I value this so much, because values, I can't really reiterate it enough. It's like the rudder that steers the boat, it just helps us keep on that one direction. Whereas if we don't know that purpose, that meaning that underlines why we're engaged in something, and it's very easy once we go away to a job to get overwhelmed with all that other stuff, that we lose that sense, and we've got to dig it up again and find it. But it's also about that satisfaction as well, and all that sort of stuff. So it's so important that when we get a new volunteer starting, and I don't know if either of your organisations do this, but I certainly know, even when I've got new PSOs sitting in front of me, because it's volunteer, I say to them, why are you doing this? Because you could be doing something else with your time, so why this? So they really tick over in their head as to the things that keeps them engaged. And also I have them start to think about, what's your not negotiables? Where do you draw the line and say no? And so they start to learn their own boundaries as well, rather than constantly putting themselves out, which volunteers are great at doing. They just give. And we've got to actually start to say to them as well, where do you stop? Where is your not negotiables that you're going to say, right, I'm going to stop volunteering every night of the week. I'm only going to volunteer 2 nights a week, or something like that. Yeah.
And can I just pick up on that point from Helen? I think that's really important, because as volunteers, we're often selfless. And when we get, amongst it, people love it. That's a passion. That's what we like to do, and so out the window goes the fatigue management, the self-care, all those things that maintain well-being and positive mental health. And so I think that, it's important to be able to just, remember that it's okay, for the volunteers to be able to say no. And, you know, I don't want to go back up again and again and again. You know, I just need some time to stop and process what's happened. And also, sorry, just on that, I wanted to pick up a note that Wade said. We know that, and certainly I can speak from New South Wales, that all the emergency services in New South Wales do actually have a wellbeing and/or mental health psychological support program of some description. So I think that we do need to acknowledge that, you know, whether or not, but be that volunteers or paid, whether or not the person or individuals, you know, choose to access it is certainly, you know, the choice of the individual. But I just thought that, you know, we need to acknowledge the fact that the emergency services do actually, you know, have, you know, resources and supports available.
Great point, Louise. And I guess it's so important that they are aware that they're there. But I guess, Wade, a question for you is, as a volunteer, do you think there's a reluctance, a sense of, oh, you know, let me leave those services for the full-time employees? You know, I'm just here on the weekend, or I've just experienced, you know, an incident which is obviously very different from a 5-day campaign or bushfire type of season. Do you think that there's a reluctance amongst volunteers to access some of those services as much as some of the, and sense that, you know, let me leave it for the others?
Oh, I don't know if volunteers are any better or worse, to be honest. I think that I'm going to put something out there. No one wants to be seen. I'm going to use a military term here for you. No one wants to be seen as broken.
Yeah.
Okay, so no one wants their colleagues or their mates, their peers, to think that they may be suffering or process, or they're not able to do their job. So I just put that out there. That's just human beings are like that. I think volunteers do access services if they know about them. But and I'm pretty sure that Louise will jump on this when I throw this out there. But what we do know is that they will access services is that they trust the services. So if we're creating systems and models out there for volunteers in particular, they need to know that they can trust what they're going to go to is going to be confidential. It's going to help them, and you know that there's a process involved, so they understand it. So I think there is a reluctance, but it's probably more to do with a lack of understanding in a volunteer world, because you know there's not an expectation. You're going back to work on Monday. So yeah, it's a very interesting space. I'm sure the others have got something to say on it, but I don't think it's one way or the other. Volunteers don't have the ongoing induction or orientation process that I suppose paid employees get. So they're probably less likely to access services based on that.
You're right though too, Wade. We, like, as a professional, you know, we've got to get boots on the ground. We've got to get down in it to actually not only understand it, but also to have others understand that we are confidential, that we are relatable as well. Because why would you go to someone and have a chat with someone if you think, God, you know, they're just going to pathologize me and put me in a box? Whereas if they feel like this person will actually sit and listen to me and not judge me, you know, that they feel like I can actually go and talk to that person. So yeah, we've got to get boots on the ground. And I think that's why peer supports are so great, because, you know, they are the boots on the ground. People see them there, you know, that's the thing.
Oh, you're talking to the converted, Helen. Can I just say, I think, you know, there's still that stigma, as much as I, you know, hate to say it, there's certainly still the stigma around reaching out for support. And I think we need to factor in, as I said earlier, when we're talking about volunteers are busy. You know, they're everyday Australians who have jobs, who may be at university, you know, they've got other commitments, they've got family lives, they may be retired, whatever. So even though the supports may be there, and resources are available, they may not access them because of time and even dollars as well. You know, sometimes those sorts of things come into factor. But I mean, I'm, you know, all on board with what Helen was saying. From certainly my research from Churchill Fellowship, we know generally that when someone is struggling or distressed, that they're more likely to look to their peer before they actually reach out to EAP or VEAP or whatever it may be, professional services. And I think, but it's the peer support programs need to be credible. And when I talk about credible, that's very much around trust. It's very much about confidentiality, being able to, you know, someone feels safe, and there's that element of psychological safety within the organisation, you know, to be able to access those support services, peer support programs.
Yeah, and it also though comes when we look at other research too, what we also know is it's not just our peers, it's got to come from within the ranks too. That we know that if say we experience a trauma in our professional life, it needs to come from not only our peers but those in the tiers above that sort of say, yep, we got you, that then that trauma doesn't stick. And that's the thing. We can have all these predispositional factors sitting in the background, you know, previous trauma, previous mental health, family of mental health, all this stuff. But if we get that support that's there from actually within the organisation, it reduces the likelihood of trauma sticking phenomenally.
So Helen, you've just touched on a little bit of space that I'm quite passionate about, and that's about that leadership component when it comes to peer support and well-being within volunteer space. So, you know, it's all well and good. We say we're going to do training. We're going to you know, provide people with safe exposure, etc., etc. But the challenge that I put out there, and I'm not sure who's out there behind these screens, so I can only see 4 people on my screen. I'm going to challenge those of you out there who are in leadership roles that, you know, you need to walk the walk with this process as well. You need to understand what the wellbeing models are. You need to understand what, you know, peer support is, and you actually have to live it within your organisation. And you actually have to trust. You have to trust the system as well. So that information, that confidentiality, and the peer support models that you put in place, you need to trust that that's going to be okay. Because more often than not, I see in sort of, you know, bigger organisations, there's a need to know all this information. There's a need to sort of, oh, you know, we're going to risk manage this process. But peer support sometimes doesn't actually fit well with that, and, you know, well-being doesn't always fit well with risk management. It's an interpersonal process that relies on 2 people actually connecting and providing that sort of hope and, you know supporting resilience, etc. So yeah, so I sort of just throw that in there as an adjunct to the conversation. I'm not sure if anyone's got anything to add on that.
Yeah, well, Wade, I think just such an important topic. I mean, the leadership within these organizations, you're absolutely right. We've seen time and time again that also you can have all the EAPs and programs that you like, but unless the leadership truly, authentically endorses it, not just in words, but in their actions as well, then it doesn't really get traction and people are reluctant to use it. And coming through on our chat this evening has been a comment about, you know, it's very hard to admit you need help. It's there's a reluctance that if they are not sure that, you know, if they ask for help, that they will be held back from going on to other events and other incidents. And so, you know, we've touched on that stigma as well as such a critical area. And hopefully if we have a little bit of time, we can come back and ask the question, you know, what's it going to take to break that? Because, you know, clearly we are humans, we're not machines. We're exposed as first responders to some pretty exceptional circumstances very often. And how are we supposed to file that, especially as a volunteer? Before I go there, though, Louise, an interesting question for you, really, is that the fact that how do we get you? So you've been instrumental in creating these peer support programs and rolling them out. So how do we get the message out to volunteers about the support and the process in a confidential way?
Do you mean in terms of establishing a program, being able to, or accessing support? Accessing. Well, again, I think it comes back to that psychological safety of the organisation. So we need to embed these peer support programs, as we've said, from the boardroom to the front line, boots on the ground, as Helen says. Because when you have that sense of, again, we're all in it together. It's in policies, it's in procedures, there's good solid training, and there's the program, and also there's a process in terms of having peers nominated. So it's not just I'm upright breathing, I'm going to be a peer support officer or a peer supporter, because that doesn't always work. Well intended doesn't mean well done. And so I think that, organisationally, the way, we've done it previously in some of the, the good programs that I've seen set up, is that it's by nomination. So you nominate who you would actually go and talk to if you're struggling or distressed. But again, there needs to be that sense of awareness about the program. So, again, it's embedded, as Wade said, the organisation lives and breathes it, supports it, resources it, all those, things that make effective, incredible programs work. In terms of someone accessing it, if it's a solid peer support program and a credible, one that's set up and well done, people will access it. People actually, and again, it's about numbers as well. Internationally, I know that, some of the programs that I visited overseas in frontline services, emergency services, there were, a large pool of peer support officers for the workforce. So again, it depends on the investment that the organisation actually want to make. The ones that work well have got generally the coordinators. And so, I mean, there's lots of it's multifaceted. And so, a good, effective peer support program, I think, needs to be, it's strategically mapped out, and it's actually, strategically mapped out and implemented, with the support and the investment and commitment of the organisation. As you say, not tokenistic, it's actually about, we genuinely want to look after our own, and we want to make sure that their mental health and well-being, we're promoting positive mental health and well-being in the organisation. So we will actually invest in this process.
Yeah, I agree. And I think so important for the managers to fully endorse it, be part of that process, or else it does just, sit on a shelf somewhere and doesn't become reality.
But then can I also just say on that, we can't rely, like peer support programs cannot rely just on one individual who's got a passion and a drive. There needs to be that succession planning. It needs to be, again, strategically mapped out, because all too often the person who has the drive and the passion leaves the organisation, and then, it falls apart. So there needs to be actually embedded, strategically, so that it's long lasting. It's not just, it's sustainable. It's not just because someone's left, it falls to pieces.
Yeah, agreed. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left, just over 10 minutes left. So maybe a last question for you, Helen. One area that I know you deal a lot with is the issue of burnout in volunteers, and would be really interested to hear your thoughts on how do you recognize it, especially for family and friends and people outside of the more formal first responder community. And secondly, what are some ways that you encourage people to have early intervention and steer that in a different direction? So we'd love to hear your thoughts about, how common it is and how you advise people to manage it.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a nice question. And to be honest, I really couldn't give you a figure on how common it is, because the reality is working with volunteers, when they get burnt out, they just stop coming. And, can we honestly say that the reasons why they stop coming is because they're burnt out? We can't. So it's very, very hard to put a number on burnout within volunteers. But the things that we can look for when we're actually seeing that perhaps someone's teetering on the edge there, if they've been involved enough with the organisation for a while, maybe, as I mentioned earlier, is those bit of characteristic changes, a bit of cynicism, or, or maybe they even become more closed off. Normally they'd be the first, yeah, but they're not. They're sort of withdrawing a little bit more. And you might even hear them talking about things like, we've recently got new radios in the area here, and some of them were talking about how they just felt so overwhelmed by it. Now, that to me is a big alarm bell. If you're feeling like really gobsmacked and having so much difficulty absorbing how to learn to operate radios, and let's face it, they're not exactly the easiest thing in the world to do anyway. But, that says to me, maybe this person's getting close. Maybe we're pushing their skill set too hard, too fast, And the other thing is that, I don't know about both of you with your St. John's ambulance stuff, but when you're learning these things of, say, learning how to use a radio, you probably sit there and you're reflecting, how does this actually create an impact for the job? My job is fixing people, or my job is fighting fires or things like that, and I'm learning how to use a radio, so they can actually lose that sense of that they're actually making an impact. And so we've got to keep giving to them these, not just statistics, but, having them recognize, even on the most mundane task, when you go to training, how much of an impact that has, what it does for the community, and so on and so forth. So we've got to keep promoting that to them. And the thing is, when we do it, though, we've got to make it genuine. Like, don't just sit there and send out another email. That's nothing worse than that, okay? So you've actually got to keep promoting that with them. And basically, there's some of the big signs. And I guess the reliability too. If they're not turning up all the time, if they were the one consistently there every Thursday night for training, and now they're too busy on a Thursday, they're sometimes turning up. And there's the signs that they might be getting burnt out. And all it takes is just a gentle conversation. And sometimes it's a matter of also highlighting to them, thanking them about their impact that they're having. That's why I'm all for barbecues, not only because it's an Aussie tradition, but because they really are great. They connect us. They have us feeling like this is community. I don this orange suit with the SES because, here I am with my buddies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so many of those points are just so important in terms of the sense that, a volunteer doesn't always see the bigger picture in terms of the impact that their work has for a bigger organization and the important work of the SES. They're just like, I'm doing my Thursday shift, but don't sometimes understand that as an army of volunteers, how critical they are to so many huge situations. And, I think it's so important to acknowledge that the value that volunteers are offering in organizations, and say thank you from the bottom of our hearts that you give so freely of yourselves to such important work that keeps us safe and that protects us. So
do they have days that celebrate like things like St. John's Day for you guys, Louise and Wayne? Because I know they have SES Day and stuff here in Queensland.
No, we certainly promote. It depends on each division, and we try to, and I'm a bit biased because I obviously think that St. John do it well, but we try to promote that sense of community, connectedness, family for some people, whatever that might look like. Because remember, we have cadets as well. You know, so we're also, you know, investing in our future in terms of the young people. So we do try to, you know, celebrate, you know, events and even just, you know, get-togethers. But just on that burnout, I think it's important to remember, as I said before, is that volunteers, you know, also have lives. So although, you know, they might drop off and not attend an event or whatever post-critical incident, you know, we may actually think, oh, well, that's because, you know, they are deployed to the bushfires, for instance, they deployed to a critical incident. But in fact, we don't know what's happening in their real lives, their everyday lives. And they could, you know, there's lots of things that, you know, happen in life. So, you know, it's a bit like the chicken and the egg as well, you know, certainly. So there's things that can happen in people's everyday lives that can certainly contribute to the impact that it may have in their volunteering life. And that then makes me think it goes back to the, you know, the leaders, the peers, to know your people. Because if you know that, you know, Helen's working and, you know, things at work aren't going well for her, or she's, you know, having a relationship issue as an example, you know, you're more attuned to be able to think, well, perhaps, you know, Helen's gone out and been deployed, has potentially been exposed to something quite traumatic. We just got to have to keep an eye on her. So I think it's a whole combination of, you know, not only the exposure potentially that our volunteers could be, you know, may experience, but also what else is happening in their own day-to-day lives as well that can contribute to that burnout process.
Yeah, and I think of one of the strategies that we do when because sometimes burnout just happens. It doesn't matter, you can put all this stuff in place and we can't assure that it's not going to happen exactly as you're saying, Louise. It might be other things outside in our greater lives. So it is about also when they actually do seem to have that sort of stuff going on, encourage them that it's okay, we can reduce the workload, but you're always welcome back here. Give them that sort of temporary option to sort of, hey, why don't you take a secondment for a little while and come back and tell me how you feel in 3 months' time, or tell me how you feel in a month's time, or something like that. Yeah.
I think, Helen, one of the things that first responders, you know, paid or volunteers, traditionally, I think historically, we're much better at it today than we were yesterday, is actually being vulnerable ourselves. You know, we put on our capes and our masks and we go off to save the world. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, being able to turn around and say something, I just need to tap out for a while, is really hard for some people, because that vulnerability is not something that's, I would say, traditionally not trained. We're not encouraged to be vulnerable. So yeah, I would totally encourage people to actually talk, you know, connect, engage, etc. And that's why I get back to the peer support programs that we're talking about. I think why they're so invaluable. I'll give an example of a young guy who was involved with bushfires and whatever else, and there was an incident, etc. And as a peer support officer, I was actually, you know, in touch with this guy. But as it turns out, he's about to become a first dad. You know, but he put his hand up to go and save communities from fire first, and his baby was due to be born, you know, any day, etc. So the tensions that he took with him stayed with him. But yeah, so yeah, we are vulnerable. We are just human beings, and I think peer support is absolutely the way to go.
And that ties into even that question that was asked earlier about stigma. It's like where we know the signs of, you know, someone not doing well. A lot of us, well, some of us know the signs of mental health, it's deterioration stuff. A lot of us will happily say, I know that, and I'll help someone else, but it can't happen to me. We will say, yep, I can see it and I'll happily help someone else. But you know what, as a volunteer or as a healthcare professional, it doesn't happen to me though. Because that's not possible. I know all the good strategies, which is a crock, you know, it still happens to all of us. But the thing I reflect on then with that and that stigma is the great thing that helps debunk not only what mental health is, but it's also about then showing the ability to continue treading that ground after is those lived experience people. The people who have said, you know, I actually wasn't doing well. I took some time off, but I'm back, and look at me, guys. You know, they're the ones that actually, then everyone starts to go, actually, it's okay to have a bit of time off. Actually, it's okay to, you know, notice these signs and put my hand up that I've got trauma, or put my hand up that I've got anxiety or depression or things like that. They realize that it's not so taboo and it's repairable. So, you know, we talk about with trauma, a lot of people hear about post-traumatic stress and they freak out. But one of the first things I say to people when they come in, have you heard about post-traumatic growth? And they just sit there going, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I think often when people do give themselves permission to stop, to reflect, to reset, they do recharge, and often they go back in with that better you know, mindset, or, you know, they're more able to, perhaps even in some cases, are more productive.
Agreed.
Because they have stopped and, you know, had that opportunity to reset.
Come back with a new perspective. Well, Wade, Louise, Helen, we could speak for so long on this topic. Unfortunately, we're out of time for tonight, but on behalf of Wellbeing Australia and the audience, thank you so much for so generously giving of your time, your passion, your energy, your interest to this really important topic tonight. We really do appreciate it. Want to thank the attendees for being online tonight and for so actively participating in the discussion. Thank you so much. One or two things I just wanted to emphasize. The first is, just after you end this summit this evening, you will get a questionnaire or a 2-minute survey with just about 4 or 5 questions that you can fill in anonymously, but it really just helps us to understand your needs, what you liked, what you want more of in the future. So really would appreciate it if you took just a minute or two to complete that. So thank you all for that. And the second thing is, for those of you, if anybody is feeling triggered or emotional or needs some support from anything that's been discussed tonight, we're just sharing a couple of support and resources here for you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to these excellent organizations that offer incredible support. All that's left for me to do is say thank you, good night, and we look forward to seeing you all in the coming week in different sessions. Thanks so much to all of you. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.